The city at night was a different world. The bright, chaotic energy of the day had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of streetlights and the occasional lonely sound of a car in the distance. For most people, this was the time to be home, to be safe, to be off the streets, but for one young woman, this was the time to work. She sat perfectly still in a used, but well-kept, sedan parked across the street from a 24-hour diner. The engine was off and the inside of the car was dark. To anyone passing by, she would look like just another teenager, maybe waiting for a friend or perhaps just killing time. She wore a simple dark-colored hoodie and jeans. Her hands were wrapped around a large paper cup of coffee, more for the warmth than the caffeine. She was 18, with a calm and observant face that seemed older than her years. Her name was Maya, and she was on a stakeout. This wasn't some game or fantasy. It was real. She had an internship with a very important federal agency, a foot in the door of a career she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. Tonight's task was simple but crucial. Watch the diner. Take note of who goes in, who comes out, and most importantly, if a specific individual arrived. It was boring, painstaking work, but she knew it was the foundation of everything. She felt a mix of nervous excitement and serious responsibility. This was her chance to prove herself. She took a slow sip of the coffee, her eyes never leaving the diner's glowing entrance. The world inside the diner looked warm and safe. She could see a tired-looking waitress refilling a customer's cup and a cook flipping something on the grill. It was a scene of normal, everyday life. She was on the outside watching, protecting that normality in her own small way. The thought gave her a quiet sense of pride. Meanwhile, a different kind of patrol was moving through the night. 2 police cars, one following the other, turned onto the quiet street. They moved slowly, their headlights cutting bright paths through the darkness. Inside the lead car, 2 officers were chatting about a basketball game from the night before. The driver, a man in his 40s with the tired eyes of someone who has seen too much, was named Officer Miller. His partner, younger and still eager to make his mark, was Officer Davison. In the second car were Officers Grierson and Hicks. Grierson was known for his loud laugh and a confidence that sometimes crossed into arrogance. Hicks, a quieter man, usually just went along with his partner's energy. It was Officer Miller who first noticed the sedan. A single car parked in the shadows, engine off, with a single person inside. His experienced and often cynical mind immediately began to run through possibilities. A drug deal? A lookout for a robbery? Someone sleeping in their car? He clicked his radio. Unit 12 to 14, you see that vehicle? The gray sedan on the west side of the street. In the second car, Officer Grierson leaned forward, peering through the windshield. Yeah, I see it. 1 occupant. Looks young. Let's go see what we've got. A shared understanding passed between the 2 cars without another word. They had a routine for this. They pulled into the lot, not with sirens or urgency, but with a slow, deliberate authority that was meant to be noticed. Their tires crunched softly on the gravel. 1 car parked slightly behind the sedan, the other slightly in front, a casual but effective way of boxing it in. The interior of Maya's car was suddenly filled with the bright white beam of a police flashlight. It swept across her back seat, over the passenger seat, and finally settled on her face. She didn't flinch, but her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. This was not part of the plan. She watched in her side mirror as the driver of the lead car, Officer Miller, opened his door and stepped out. He adjusted his duty belt, a familiar and heavy sound of shifting leather and metal, and started walking towards her. At the same time, his partner, Officer Davison, approached from the passenger side. The officers from the second car remained in their vehicle for now, watching, their heads silhouetted against the dashboard lights. Officer Miller reached her window. He was a large man, and his presence seemed to block out the world. He tapped the glass with his flashlight. "Evening, miss." Maya rolled down her window, the quiet electric whir sounding unnaturally loud. The cool night air rushed in. She kept her hands in plain sight, resting on the steering wheel. "Good evening." "Officer," she said, her voice calm and clear, though she could feel a nervous flutter in her stomach. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here this late?" Officer Miller asked. His tone was neutral, but his eyes were busy, scanning her face, the interior of her car, looking for any sign of nervousness or guilt. Maya had prepared for this. "Just having a coffee, officer," she replied, gesturing slightly with the cup in her hand. I'm not causing any trouble. From the passenger side, Officer Davison shone his own light into the car, his gaze lingering on the floor mats and the back seat. This a popular hangout spot for you? He asked. Before she could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. Officer Grierson had decided to get out of his car and was now walking over, a casual swagger in his step. He leaned down, his face appearing next to Officer Miller's at the driver's window. We've had some reports in this area, Grierson said, his voice taking on a condescending, almost sing-song tone. Break-ins, things like that. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Maya felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It wasn't fear of being caught because she hadn't done anything wrong. It was the familiar, sinking feeling of being judged, of being seen not as a person but as a problem. She was just a black teen in a hoodie in a car, and in their eyes that was a story they already knew how to read. She took a slow, quiet breath, steadying herself. The stakeout was now the least of her concerns. A different kind of test had just begun. The air in the car suddenly felt thick and heavy. The simple, quiet night was gone, replaced by the intense focus of 4 police officers. The warm, comforting smell of coffee from the diner was now completely overpowered by the cold. Metallic scent of the patrol car and the faint leather of the officer's gear. The young woman kept her hands on the steering wheel. She could feel the cool plastic under her palms. It was a small, solid thing to focus on. Inside, her heart was beating a little faster, a steady drumbeat of tension. But on the outside, she made sure her face was a calm mask. She had learned that when people expect you to be nervous or angry, staying calm was the most powerful thing you could do. Officer Miller, the one who had first spoken, rested his forearm on the roof of her car. It was a casual gesture, but it felt like a claim of territory. Just having coffee, you say? He repeated her words, but his tone suggested he didn't believe her for a second. Most people have coffee inside the diner, where it's warm, with the lights on. His partner on the passenger side, Officer Davison, kept moving his flashlight beam around the inside of her car. The light danced over a school textbook on the back seat, an empty water bottle, and the worn-out floor mats. He was looking for something, anything, that didn't belong. You got some ID on you? He asked, his voice all business. Of course, the young woman said. She moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't want any sudden movements to be misunderstood. She reached for her wallet, which was in the pocket of her hoodie. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it to Officer Miller. He took it and shone his flashlight directly on the small plastic card. He looked from the photo to her face and back again. Okay, he said, but he didn't hand it back. He held on to it. In policing, holding on to someone's identification was a way of holding on to control. It meant the conversation wasn't over. It was then that the other officer, the one with the swagger, Officer Grierson, decided to take charge of the conversation. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a tone you might use to talk to a misbehaving child. Look, he said, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. We're not trying to ruin your night, but we've got a job to do. This area has seen some trouble. Cars broken into, a store window smashed just 2 blocks over. You sitting out here all alone in the dark? It doesn't look right. You understand that, don't you? The young woman felt a hot spark of frustration ignite in her chest. She understood what he was saying, but she also understood what he was not saying. He wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a stereotype. A young black person in a car at night could only be up to no good. It was a story she had seen play out too many times on the news and in real life. I have every right to be here, she said, her voice still even, but with a new layer of firmness underneath. I'm parked legally. I'm not disturbing anyone. I've answered your questions. Am I being detained or am I free to go? This was the key question. It was a line she knew from her training. It was a citizen asserting their rights. The officers exchanged a quick glance. This wasn't going the way they expected. They were used to people getting flustered or angry or overly apologetic. This calm, direct questioning was throwing them off. Officer Grierson's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who has just had his authority gently pushed back against. He let out a short, soft chuckle and looked at his partner in the other car, who was still watching from the driver's seat. He shook his head slightly as if to say, "Can you believe this?" "Listen to this," Grierson said, his voice loud enough for all the officers to hear. She's asking if she's being detained. Sounds like she's been watching lawyer shows on TV. A low chuckle came from the other police car. Officer Miller didn't laugh, but the faint, dismissive smile was back on his face. They were all sharing in the joke. The joke was her. They were a team, a unit, and she was just a kid who didn't know her place. The young woman felt her cheeks grow warm. The humiliation was a physical feeling, like a wave of heat. But she swallowed it down. She let their laughter hang in the air for a moment before she spoke again. "I'm just asking a simple question, officer," she said, looking directly at Grierson. "I'd like to know if I'm officially being detained for a crime. If not, then I believe this stop is over." The laughter died down. The mood shifted again. Her refusal to be intimidated was starting to irritate them. The easy, mocking control they had a moment ago was slipping away. Officer Miller straightened up, his body language becoming more official. The friendly pretense was gone. "Step out of the car, please," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. For the first time, a real jolt of anxiety shot through her. This was escalating. Getting out of the car changed everything. It was no longer a conversation through a window. It was a confrontation on the street. She knew her rights. She knew she didn't have to get out of the car for a simple traffic stop unless they had a reason. But she also knew that arguing on the street could get messy and dangerous. These officers were already looking for a reason to justify their suspicions. She made a decision. She would comply, but she would do it on her terms. "Okay," she said calmly. She turned the car key to the on position to lower the power windows the rest of the way, then turned it back. She opened the car door. The cold night air wrapped around her as she stood up. She was taller than they probably expected. She kept her hands visible at her sides. The 4 officers now surrounded her, a semicircle of uniforms and stern faces. Their smiles were gone, replaced by looks of professional scrutiny. They were waiting for her to slip up, to say the wrong thing, to act nervous. Officer Grierson looked her up and down. "Now," he said, crossing his arms, "why don't you tell us what you're really doing here? And don't give us that just having coffee story." The young woman looked from one face to another. She saw their certainty. They were so sure they had her figured out. They were waiting for a confession, for a story about meeting friends, or for her to change her details. They were ready for a teenager to break under pressure, but they were not ready for what happened next. The entire scene was about to turn upside down. The world had shrunk to the small, lit-up circle of the parking lot. The hum of the distant city faded away, replaced by the sound of her own breathing and the heavy silence of the officers waiting for an answer. The young woman stood beside her open car door, an island of stillness in the middle of their suspicion. Officer Grierson's question hung in the air. "Why don't you tell us what you're really doing here?" It was a demand, not a question. He was leaning back on his heels slightly, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a man who had all the time in the world and was enjoying the little drama he had created. The other officers watched, their faces set in neutral, professional masks, but their eyes were eager. They were an audience waiting for the next line in a play. The young woman felt the weight of all their stares. It was a physical pressure. She knew that anything she said now would be picked apart. If she repeated that she was just having coffee, they would call her a liar. If she tried to explain about the stakeout, they would laugh even harder. They weren't here for the truth. They were here for a confession that fit the story they had already written in their heads. She saw Officer Miller's eyes glance into the interior of her car again. "You don't mind if we take a quick look inside, do you?" he asked. His tone made it sound like a polite suggestion, but everyone knew it was not. This was the moment. This was the line. A search of her vehicle would be a final, humiliating violation. They would touch her things, flip through her school book, empty her glove compartment. They would find nothing, of course, but the act itself would be a message. "We have the power and you have none." She knew she could say no. She had the right to refuse a search. But she also knew that refusing often made them more suspicious. They might then say they had probable cause based on her nervousness or her defiant attitude. It was a trap, and all the exits seemed to be closing. She took a slow, quiet breath, pulling the cold night air deep into her lungs. It cleared her head. The nervous flutter in her stomach was still there, but it was joined now by a solid, cold resolve. She had tried being polite. She had tried asserting her rights. Now it was time to change the game entirely. "Actually, officer," she said, her voice remarkably steady, "that won't be necessary." Her tone had changed. It was no longer the voice of a teenager trying to be respectful to authority. It was flatter, more formal. It was the tone of someone who was used to being in control of a situation. Officer Grierson uncrossed his arms, a smirk starting to form on his face again. He thought she was just being difficult. "It'll go a lot faster if you just cooperate," he said. She didn't look at him. Her focus was on Officer Miller, who seemed to be the one in charge. She moved her right hand slowly and deliberately towards the inside pocket of her hoodie. Immediately, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The casual postures of the officers vanished. Their hands instinctively moved closer to their belts. Their bodies tensed. A move for a pocket was never a small thing in a situation like this. For a split second, they weren't seeing a teenage girl. They were seeing a potential threat. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Miller barked, his voice sharp and loud. She froze, her hand halfway to her pocket. She kept her eyes locked on Officer Miller. "I am just retrieving my identification," she said, her voice still calm but now with an edge of command that had not been there before. "From my inner pocket." Officer Miller gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes narrowed. "Slowly," he commanded. The other officers had taken a step closer, forming a tighter circle around her. All the mockery was gone from Officer Grierson's face, replaced by a hard, alert stare. The laughter from moments ago felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. With painstaking slowness, she slipped her fingers into the inner pocket of her hoodie. She wasn't reaching for her wallet. She was reaching for something else, something that was always with her. A symbol of the future she was working so hard to build. She pulled out a slim, black leather wallet, but it was too narrow for cash or credit cards. It was the kind of wallet that held only one thing. She flipped it open with a practiced one-handed motion. The polished silver of a badge caught the glare of the police car headlights. It gleamed, a bright, hard star in the darkness of the parking lot. Next to it, behind a clear plastic window, was a photo identification card. It had her picture, her name, and in bold official letters, the name of a federal agency. Below that, it said, "Intern." For a long moment, there was no sound at all. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. The officers, who a second before had been coiled springs of suspicion and authority, now seemed to turn to stone. Officer Miller was the closest. His eyes dropped from her face to the badge in her hand. He stared at it. The hard professional mask on his face shattered. His jaw went slightly slack. The confidence in his posture drained away, leaving him looking suddenly older and smaller. The flashlight in his hand, which had been pointed at her chest, drooped downwards, its beam now lighting up the gravel at their feet. Officer Grierson took an involuntary step backwards, as if he had been pushed. The smirk was gone, wiped away so completely it was hard to believe it had ever been there. His face went pale. He looked from the badge to her face and then back to the badge, his brain struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The young black teen in the hoodie was gone. In her place stood a federal intern, holding a symbol of authority that, in this moment, far outranked their own. The officer who had been sitting in the second car had gotten out and was standing by his door, frozen in place, his mouth open in a perfect circle of shock. The young woman stood perfectly still, her arm extended, holding the open wallet for them all to see. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The gleaming badge said everything. It was a key that had just unlocked the entire situation, and the lock it had broken was their own prejudice. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The smiles had not just faded. They had vanished as if they had been stolen from their faces. In their place was a raw, stunned humiliation. They had been so sure of themselves. They had laughed. They had mocked. And in doing so, they had made a terrible, professional miscalculation. The entire power dynamic in the parking lot had just been flipped upside down. The silence in the parking lot was no longer just an absence of sound. It had become a heavy, living thing. It was filled with the shock of the officers and the quiet, steady gaze of the young woman. The badge in her hand seemed to glow, catching every bit of light and holding it, a small, powerful sun in the dark night. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if they were all part of a photograph. The young woman with her arm extended, her face calm. The four officers, frozen in various states of disbelief. Officer Miller was the first to break. The veteran officer, who had seen countless surprises on the job, looked like he had been hit by a gentle but stunning wave. The tough, knowing expression he always wore had completely melted away. His eyes were wide, fixed on the federal badge. He blinked a few times very quickly, as if trying to clear his vision. This was not possible. This was not in the script. The person he had assumed was a potential troublemaker, a kid to be managed, was actually one of them? Not quite, but close enough. In that moment, the intern badge might as well have been the director's. His partner, Officer Davison, took a small, hesitant step back. The flashlight in his hand, which had been so busy searching for clues of wrongdoing, now hung limply at his side. He looked from the badge to the tired sedan and then back again. The pieces did not fit together in his mind. A federal intern should be in a suit, in a nice car, not in a hoodie and a beat-up sedan. The contradiction made his head spin. But the most dramatic change was in Officer Grierson. The man who had been so loud, so sure of himself, so quick to laugh and mock, was now utterly deflated. The color had drained from his face, leaving a pale, waxy look. His shoulders, which had been pushed back with confidence, were now slumped. He looked like a balloon that had all the air let out of it. He couldn't meet the young woman's eyes. His gaze dropped to the ground, to his own boots, anywhere but at the gleaming symbol of authority that had just dismantled his entire world. The memory of his own condescending chuckle echoed in his ears, and he felt a hot wave of shame wash over him. The young woman watched all of this happen. She saw the shock, the confusion, and the dawning horror on their faces. She felt no joy in it. There was no feeling of victory. Instead, she felt a strange, cold clarity. This was the reality of the situation she had been trying to avoid. This was what happened when assumptions took over. She slowly lowered her hand, closing the leather wallet with a soft, precise click. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet. It seemed to break the spell. Officer Miller finally found his voice. It came out as a dry, cracked whisper. You're with the feds?" The young woman nodded once. "I'm an intern," she clarified, her voice even and professional. "I'm on a low-level observation assignment. This vehicle and this location were part of my cover." The word cover seemed to hit the officers like a physical blow. They had not just been hassling a civilian. They had potentially compromised an official operation. The seriousness of their mistake settled over them, colder than the night air. Officer Miller's mind was racing, trying to backtrack, to find a way to salvage the situation. We had no idea," he stammered. "There were reports of break-ins. We were just doing a routine check." His explanation sounded weak and hollow, even to his own ears. The young woman didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. She could see the gears turning in his head, the frantic search for an excuse that would not come. She then shifted her gaze, letting it sweep over each of the officers in turn, making sure to hold Officer Grierson's downcast eyes for a brief second. "The encounter is now over," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. "I will be documenting this interaction in my official report. My supervisor will be very interested to understand how a low-priority observation was interrupted by local patrols." The word report landed with a thud. This was no longer just an embarrassing moment. This was going on paper. This was going to their bosses. Officer Miller visibly flinched. Officer Grierson looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Without another word, the young woman turned. It was a calm, deliberate movement. She opened her car door and slid back into the driver's seat. The interior of the car felt like a sanctuary now. The familiar smell, the feel of the steering wheel. She placed the wallet with the badge carefully on the passenger seat in plain view. Outside, the officers stood rooted to the spot. They didn't move to stop her. They didn't say another word. They just watched a group of uniformed men rendered silent and powerless by a young woman and a small piece of metal. She closed her car door. The solid thunk echoed in the silence. She didn't look at them again. She started the engine. The sound was loud and normal, breaking the strange frozen scene. She put the car in drive and pulled slowly away from the curb, leaving the 4 officers standing alone in the empty parking lot, surrounded by the wreckage of their own assumptions. The gentle hum of the car's engine was the only sound. The young woman drove slowly, her hands firm on the steering wheel. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't need to. The image of the 4 stunned officers, frozen in the pool of light from their own cars, was burned into her mind. For a few blocks, she just drove, letting the normal rhythm of the road calm her racing heart. The tightness in her chest began to loosen. She took a deep, shuddering breath and then another, feeling the air fill her lungs. It was over. But the feeling inside her was complicated. There was no thrill of victory, no desire to cheer. Instead, she felt a deep, heavy tiredness. She thought about the look on their faces, the shock, the instant regret, the vanished smiles. It was a powerful moment, but it was also a sad one. It shouldn't have had to happen that way. She shouldn't have needed a badge to be treated with basic respect. Back in the parking lot, the silence was thick and uncomfortable. The two police cars sat empty, their doors still open, interior lights glowing like lonely beacons. Officer Miller was the first to move. He let out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his chin. He felt old. The confidence he carried with him on every shift felt cracked and broken. He had been so sure. He had looked at a young person in a car and seen a problem. He had never once considered she might be one of the good guys. Miller. His partner, Officer Davison, said softly. His voice was hesitant. What just happened? Officer Miller just shook his head. There were no words. A few feet away, Officer Grierson finally looked up from the ground. His face was still pale. He walked slowly back to his patrol car, his steps heavy. He slid into the driver's seat and just sat there, staring blankly through the windshield. The memory of his own mocking laugh played over and over in his mind. He felt a hot shame burning in his gut.
He had been a bully.
He had used his authority not to protect but to feel powerful, and it had blown up in his face in the most spectacular way possible. His partner, the quieter officer, got into the passenger seat and closed the door. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The disappointment in the air was enough. Officer Miller finally clicked his radio. His voice was flat, drained of all its usual authority. Dispatch Unit 12, Code 4, false alarm, just a citizen. He couldn't bring himself to say anything more. The reply from dispatch was a simple, copy Unit 12. The word citizen echoed in the quiet car. It was a word they used every day, but tonight it felt different. It felt heavier. A citizen they had failed. A citizen they had judged and mocked. The young woman drove until she found a quiet, well-lit park. She pulled over and turned off the engine. The stakeout was over for the night. Her focus was gone. She pulled out her personal phone. She needed to hear a familiar voice. She called her mentor, the person at the agency who had believed in her and given her this chance. She told the story in a calm, steady voice, sticking to the facts. She didn't shout or get emotional. She just explained what had happened, from the moment the patrol cars pulled in to the moment she drove away. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then her mentor spoke, his voice low and serious. Are you okay? The simple question almost broke her calm. A lump formed in her throat. I'm fine, she said, her voice only wavering a little. I'm just tired. We'll talk about this in the morning, her mentor said. You did everything right. You handled it perfectly. Write it all down exactly as you remember it. This is important. She knew what he meant. It wasn't just important for her. It was important for the report, for the record. It was a story that needed to be told. After she hung up, she sat for a long time in the dark car, watching the leaves on the trees sway in the night breeze. She thought about the badge on the seat beside her. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a responsibility. It was a shield, yes, but it was also a mirror. Tonight it had forced those officers to see their own reflection. It had shown them their own biases, their own quickness to judge. She knew that for them, the night would end with paperwork and uncomfortable conversations with their sergeant. There would be consequences. But for her, it ended with a new understanding. The world wasn't fair. People would look at her and make assumptions. But she had power too. The power of her mind, her calmness, and her credentials. She had proven to herself that she could stand her ground not with anger, but with unshakable professionalism. She started the car again. The road ahead was quiet and dark, but her path felt clearer than ever. She was no longer just a student or just an intern. She was a young woman who had faced down a difficult test and had not backed down. She had held her ground, and in doing so, she had found a new strength within herself. The night had been long, But it had also taught her exactly who she was and what she was capable of becoming.